Hello, my name is Bruce MacKinnon, Tech Service Specialist with BASF. I want to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of the Canola Week for allowing BASF and myself to participate in the pre-harvest panel. Today, I'm going to just give you a short update on heat LQ as a harvest aid in canola, and then afterwards I'll be happy to join the panel for further discussion. So let's get into the presentation. Why do we use a pre-harvest aid? So for growers, we really want to help the crop and wheat dry down, resulting in a much more efficient harvest. Crops that we look at that receive a pre-harvest application in Western Canada include canola, cereals, pulses like red lentils and field peas. In pre-harvest, there's two herbicide options that are used. First, there's a contact herbicide, which causes rapid dry down of the plant tissues that they come in contact with. They may not result in complete plant death. Examples of this is the dicot family of products. Second herbicide is a systemic herbicide. It translocates to growing points of the plant. This leads to complete plant death and reduced risk of regrowth, but plants take longer to dry down. An example of this is glyphosate. Heat LQ, when we add it in, has both systemic and contact properties, which helps speed up crop and weed dry down for a faster harvest and cleaner fields the following spring. So heat has some systemic movement. It can translocate throughout the plant, which mitigates regrowth potential and improves dry down. However, BASF has learned over the years in many trials that if we treat it like a contact herbicide, we get much better performance. So overall, adding more water, using more water, we get better overall activity. When we think about the use rate in canola for pre-harvest, we look at heat LQ a case at 40 acres to a case or 43 mils to an acre. Adding 1 jug of merge at 200 mils an acre minimum, and always tank mixing where on registered crops with glyphosate at 1 relative equivalent liter per acre. In the dry conditions that we had in southern Alberta and southwest Sask this year, highly recommended our growers put the second jug of merge in to help with the overall performance and dry down of the crop and pretty droughty weeds. To maximize heat LQ performance, we have a crop staging guide. This guide for all crops is available off our Ag Solutions website that growers and agronomists and retailers can download. For canola, we're looking at 80% seed color change. And when we think about at around that 80% seed color change, we've done a lot of trials with growers over the years where we look at different water volumes, comparing heat and glyphosate versus glyphosate from 5, 10, and 15 gallons. In this particular trial, we did it in 2019 with a grower out of Wilkie, Saskatchewan. These pictures taken are 2 weeks after treatment in mid-September. You can see that from left to right, we've got 5 gallons per acre of glyphosate and same water volume of heat and glyphosate. And then then we move up to 10 gallons of heat and glyphosate and finally 15. When you get from left to right, you definitely see a change in the stalks, stems from very much green from the left to getting much more dry down on the right. If we fast forward 2 weeks to 28 days after treatment, we definitely now could still see at 5 gallons, both for glyphosate and heat and glyphosate, some green in the stalks. But as we get to the 15 gallons per acre with heat and glyphosate, we can definitely see that the stalks dry down and that crop is ready for straight cutting and would be very efficient. Overall, the more water we see applied with heat and glyphosate, the better the dry down both on the crop and the weeds. So when we think about maximizing performance and getting a complete crop dry down and increasing harvest productivity, heat plus glyphosate is way more effective than just straight glyphosate for our dry down purposes. If we think about productivity bushels per hour on that graph to the right, heat LQ plus glyphosate versus just leaving that crop standing naturally, the productivity at harvest time will gain you more bushels per hour. Moving into looking at how the broad spectrum and improved weed dry down from the tank mix of heat LQ and glyphosate at pre-harvest time. Here's a picture of looking at annual sow thistle 14 days after treatment. We've got heat and glyphosate on the left and glyphosate on the right, and you really notice the stems are dried down with the heat and glyphosate versus they're very much green still, and would cause some a lot more difficulty in harvesting with the glyphosate on the right. Again, kind of the same scenario with cleavers. We've got cleavers on the top that are green just with glyphosate, and again, a much more complete dry down with heat and glyphosate on the bottom. Finally, when we look untreated versus treated with for wild buckwheat, 14 days after treatment, again, we have improved weed dry down with heat and glyphosate. So overall, we have a pretty broad spectrum of weeds that heat and glyphosate will pick up and help with the dry down before coming in and straight cutting your canola. When we think about overall improving harvest productivity, this picture really does sum up really what you can expect and what you really hope for. So on the right-hand side, we got heat, LQ, and glyphosate, the stubble after harvest, almost 4 weeks after treatment. You can see there's little green. It's very, very dried down, and it's set up for being very clean for next spring. On the left-hand side, we just have straight glyphosate, whereas green, and we have a higher risk and more potential for potential regrowth and green material sitting there. So overall, when we want to maximize heat LQ performance, we've talked already a lot about water volume. More water, the better. We know that we should be treating it like a contact pre-harvest aid herbicide. So we want to look at 15, 20 gallons will help the speed of crop and weed dry down. The other factor that we want to look at is environment and timing our application in the fall around the weather forecast, either pre or post application. We can't control the forecast, but we certainly can try to work around it. So we want to avoid periods with precipitation or high humidity, which will slow the overall crop dry down. If we can select the days where we can apply our heat, where we're going to have more sunshine, maybe perhaps a little bit warmer depending on the time of year, heat LQ will be activated and will maximize its overall performance. The question we get, and I get all the time about using heat LQ as a pre-harvest, is how many days to dry down? What can I expect? And setting expectations is being realistic with the growers and agronomists out there is really, really important. And it'll vary by region, it'll vary by year, and it'll be based a lot on environmental conditions. So if we think about 21 versus fall of 2019 or 2020, that 14 to 21 days for 2021 was probably in the ballpark for dry down and able to get in there and start harvesting. However, in 2019 and 2020 in many regions, that's 21 plus days. So you really have to factor in all the performance factors to make heat LQ work and the environment that you're dealing with. So when we think about, again, setting expectations, large weeds. So on the right there is a weed that we encounter in southern Alberta and Southwest Sask. That's our friend kochia. They're very large, and in 2021, they were very drought-stricken, and due to the high temperatures and very dry conditions, alongside of them this year was lamb's quarters as well. So they were above the crop, they were very large, and they required to be some sort of way of drying them down in order to be able to straight cut that canola. So when you think about heat plus glyphosate, you can be confident that it'll be the best outcome based on the conditions that you can possibly use. However, you need to make sure that you treat it again like a contact pre-harvest product like Reglone. So if you're going to use 20 plus gallons per acre of water, you want to do the same with your heat glyphosate tank mix. Overall, when you're dealing with large weeds like this, chances are the crop will be dried down and ready to harvest before the weeds are dried down. If we think about just looking at some 5 application best management tips, these are from Dr. Tom Wolf's spray recommendations for pre-harvest applications. The first one is to evaluate the canopy. So is the goal to kind of control weeds that are at the bottom, like buckwheat and dandelions, or are you looking at weeds like thistles or kochia that we just saw, or lamb's quarters that are near the top? Secondly, if you're trying to accelerate the crop dry down, where is it green in the canopy? Is it down below, or is it in the middle, or is it up top? Point number two, hidden targets require more water, slower travel speeds, and finer sprays. Tied into that with point number three, the smaller droplets or finer sprays have a better chance of moving through the canopy. So we want to use higher pressures and or finer nozzles to create these smaller droplets. Forward, if we can point our nozzles backwards, we can help maybe get that spray pattern, that spray droplets into the canopy and down to the bottom. And finally, we've talked a lot about this, but use more water. And in this case, Dr. Tom Wolf recommends testing your water to make sure your quality, especially when tank mixing glyphosate, is the turbidity and hardness. You want to check those two factors out. Depending on what your test comes back, you may or may not need to add ammonia sulfate or a water conditioner. So when we look at expectation settings with heat LQ pre-harvest, we often dealing with multi-stage canola. In many years, that's pretty much a standard when we're looking at going out to a field to, go looking at an InVigor pod shatter hybrid, and we're trying to make recommendations. So what can heat LQ do, and what cannot heat LQ do? So when we look at what it can do, it can help alleviate moderate staging differences and facilitate overall crop dry down. It can manage some of these difficult broadleaf weeds such as buckwheat, cleavers, lamb's quarters, and kochia. And at the end of the day, it improves harvestability and combine efficiency. What it cannot do is force crop maturity or speed up the crop maturity, protect it against frost events, and then overcome poor environmental dry down conditions in the fall. Finally, heat LQ will not cause heated canola in bins. So when we're dealing with multi-stage crops in canola, we have to be realistic. When we're applying heat LQ to a variable stages in a crop, the less mature canola plants are going to take longer than the ones that are applied at 80% seed color chain. We need to consider the calendar and weather following applications when making recommendations. More water will help with product efficacy, and we want to always add glyphosate as a tank mix partner. So when we're dealing with multi-stage crops, there's often no perfect recommendation for some fields. At BASF, we will provide the information for our growers, consultants, and retails where heat LQ will work best and what application tips will make heat LQ work better in your canola. So at the end of the day, the goal is to have an easier harvest. We want to have consistent crop and weed dry down, and we want to improve that harvest efficiency. We want it easier to cut to reduce stress for growers at a very busy time of year so we can get the crop off as quickly as possible. We want to harvest more bushels per hour and cover more acres per liter of fuel. And we want to improve the dry down. So when we think about the InVigor canola pod shatter reduction hybrids, we've got the best tool from a genetic point of view. Now we want to help with that dry down, and we want to complete that harvest quicker to get more bushels in the hopper. At the end of the day, we want to have less stockage, and we want to set up that field to be clean for next spring, as we see on the right of this picture versus the left. Overall, this is a picture taken by my colleague Leighton Blasco up at Fort Saskatchewan. When you're applying heat pre-harvest and glyphosate on the right-hand side, help mitigate any of green regrowth, weed growth, and crop regrowth for more consistent crop and weed dry down and a more efficient harvest. With that, I will thank the organizers of the Canola Week again, and I look forward to joining the panel.